This talk is in celebration of an exhibition we have at my gallery, James Barron Art, which is in booth B10, and we have Sol LeWitt and Janet Sobel together in our booth. So David is the author of two amazing books on Sol LeWitt, which are forming the pedestal for a computer. One is called Stricken Beauty, and the other is Locating Sol LeWitt. They're both published by Yale University Press, and I highly recommend both. David is also at work on a new book which explores the relationship of Sol's wall drawings and his gouaches to historical painting. And so welcome, David, professor at University of Massachusetts.
Thanks, and for those interested in LeWitt and perhaps these publications, there's actually a discount flyer that Yale University Press put together with a little code. So please feel free to pick up this flyer as you leave the talk. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and want to talk a little bit about the new project that I'm working on. But say to begin that my published projects on Sol LeWitt, part of my goal from the beginning was to explore little known aspects of LeWitt's career and to re-examine well-known aspects, but try to approach them in new ways. And there is so much to discover about LeWitt all the time. So I'm working on a third project as well. So the first project, Stricken Beauty, was about printmaking and LeWitt. And the book on the right, Locating Sol LeWitt, is a book of essays with 8 contributors working on many facets of LeWitt, from his photography, his artist books, works on paper, but also looking again at the structures and wall drawings as well. So I do recommend these publications, and especially the great contributors for the book of essays. But now I'm working on this third project, and these are good images to begin with. These 2 portraits of LeWitt. On the left in 1961, this was a photo featured in the New York Times, an article about struggling artists, and LeWitt was definitely struggling at that time in '61, trying to figure out what he was about. And then the image on the right from the early 2000s of Sol LeWitt working in his Chester, Connecticut studio, which he built in 1990. So this new project explores, as James was saying, LeWitt's dialogue with painting over his career. And this is something, at the beginning of LeWitt's career, there was a lot of discussion about the wall drawings and how they were a new kind of drawing. So it was seeing his work in relationship to the history of drawing. And I'm very much interested in seeing his work in terms of the history of painting. Because if you know anything about the wall drawings, of course, they're over 1,300 wall drawings in total, and they begin mainly as works in pencil directly on the wall, but then they become more and more painterly over time. So that interests me. And then, of course, he had this committed and disciplined practice in his studio of painting, making gouaches on paper. And even though some people know about that, most people don't. So today we're really exploring the unknown LeWitt, and the work that James is displaying here is very much all of the work that you're showing. Really, I think it's surprising to people in terms of what they know about LeWitt. So in between these 2 photos, of course, is the well-known mature artist that gives us the structures. That's what he called his sculpture. These cubic modular works mainly, and of course the wall drawings, which I think most people know if you know something about LeWitt. They begin as pencil directly on the wall, but then they, by the mid-70s, they morph into thicker lines that are drawn with crayon on colored backgrounds, as you see in this example. And then by the 80s, the lines become thicker, they transform into bands. And also the technique becomes more complex, more painterly, layers of color ink washes that create more than just the primary colors and black. Those were the main colors that he used, and give us the secondary colors and other hues. And then this view of the display at Mass MoCA in North Adams, Massachusetts, that shows 3 different wall drawings. And by this point, in the mid-90s, many of the wall drawings become purely painted in acrylic paint, opaque, bold acrylic color that make up these wall drawings. So hopefully you know something about that LeWitt. But we want to talk about, and I want to talk about the LeWitt that you don't know that well.
Before we leave that though,
Yeah.
can we talk just a minute about Sol LeWitt and the idea of the certificate, the instructions for the draftspeople, for those who don't know that, because it's an important concept for LeWitt, and maybe a touch on LeWitt and music a little bit.
Yeah. So LeWitt is a pioneer of minimal and conceptual art, who famously wrote 2 manifestos about conceptual art, sentences on conceptual art and paragraphs on conceptual art, and famously said that championing the idea over the finished product, said that the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. And the actual execution of the artwork was, as he said, a perfunctory affair, which sounds somewhat dismissive, but he was far from dismissive in terms of what he wanted to achieve in the finished product, as you see in these works. But yeah, they depend on a set of directions usually, and a certificate. They're all numbered. They became numbered over time. This is 289. And so the work is the idea, which exists as a set of instructions and usually a diagram that accompanies it. So if you collect the wall drawings, that's what you receive, and put that away in a file, which can be dangerous. Museums sometimes lose track of these sheets of paper because they aren't clear on this conceptual idea. And the work is carried out by draftspeople that follow the directions. So very quickly, he made the first wall drawing in 1968, and then very quickly, within a year or so, he had assistants helping him so he could achieve larger and larger wall drawings and more complex wall drawings. So it was really necessary that he have a group of assistants. And then he also quickly saw that he could depend on artists that could create or follow the directions in very precise ways and execute the work at a high level, and that was
But
important.
almost also is like a composer, and then there's the orchestra. And I think that's a really interesting concept. So the idea actually is the artwork. And as David is alluding to, I know of a gallery that had the certificate rather than a photocopy of the certificate. It was lost while they had the work. And they had to go to the insurance company and say the work is lost. And the insurance company said, it's right there. So but that's not the work. The work was the certificate. So it's a really important distinction. Great artists have great ideas that are huge. And this was a really huge idea. Nobody had really come up with that concept.
Yeah, so he was fond of the analogy to a composer and the idea of the drafters playing his music or his ideas and executing them. Also, he worked briefly in the 50s for the office or the architectural firm of I.M. Pei. And he was also fond of that analogy, that he was like an architect. He draws up the designs and has the ideas, but of course doesn't build the building in the end. This view of mass mocha, my interest in LeWitt really began with the exhibition of the wall drawings, 105 wall drawings at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in North Adams. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend this pilgrimage. This show is up until 2043. So you have plenty of time, and you can go over and over again. It's 3 floors. It's unlike anything that I can think of in terms of a contemporary artist.
It's the mecca for Sol LeWitt wall drawings throughout the world, and it's something that was orchestrated by the artist and his, actually Susanna Singer, who was the head of his studio and a dear friend of mine, so that people could go and just kind of live with it and see a history of the wall drawings. My gallery's in South Kent, Connecticut. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes away from New York. It's not that much further. From Boston,
I'm in
what is
Boston. It's about 3 hours or so, and I've visited it opened in 2008, the year after he passed away, and I've gone every year, once, twice, 3 times sometimes, but it really inspired my work in terms of these projects. So you can geek out on Sol LeWitt there for sure. So back to our narrative. So returning to this picture that, as I said, is from 1961, the New York Times, a story about struggling artists. And he was one of about 6 or 7 people that was profiled. And at this point, I think he was really happy that he had made $1,000 selling his paintings in the year before. But he was living on 24 Montgomery Street. This is a building that no longer survives, but it's about 15 minutes from here, this street. And I love this photo because he's surrounded by paintings that are leaning against the wall. There's a painting hanging in the background. There's his bed nearby. So this was a cold water flat, a loft that he used as an apartment and studio. This is right before he moved the next year to 117 Hester Street, which is still there. You can make a pilgrimage there, where he lived for quite a while. LeWitt at this point was a happy cat owner, as you see, but also was struggling to figure out, he thought of himself as a painter. He had arrived in New York late in 1953. He had a variety of jobs working in graphic design at the firm of I.M. Pei. But he really tired of these things, and by this point he had taken a job at the Museum of Modern Art as a kind of night receptionist at the information desk or employee's entrance. And he met a lot of important people there in his life, Dan Flavin, Robert Ryman, Robert Mangold, Lucy Lepard, and started to form a community. Right before this photo was taken, in the years right before, he had explored what was, of course, of such impact when he had moved to New York. So he worked in an abstract expressionist style. So I can show you one picture painting that survives. This is in the New Britain Museum of American Art. Seascape from 1955. He talked about this a bit, that he did try to be an abstract expressionist. And you can see this is fully kind of inspired by Franz Klein and other artists. I'll show you some details. This really hands-on working of the paint with full-out gesture and exposed brushstrokes and moments of chance and accident, splatter and drip, really working the surface in this really thick way. But he said that he couldn't quite live up to being an abstract expressionist. The lifestyle just wasn't for him. He would go to the Cedar Bar and hang out with painters. But LeWitt was a fairly soft-spoken and shy individual, and this kind of bragging and debating wasn't for him. But he still was interested in exploring painting, and so when this photo was taken, and all these paintings surrounding him, he later in an interview said he threw away a lot of work from this period. But he was determined to explore different subject matter and different styles. And part of my research revealed a set of slides that he made documenting a lot of the work from this period when he lived in this apartment on Montgomery Street. So he took some of the paintings up to the roof and photographed them in full sunlight. Others he photographed in the window light that is hitting him here in this photo. So I want to show you some of these slides that he made. And it does give us a great sense of what the work was like. This is one painting that he took on top of the roof. You can just see the Empire State Building on the upper left very faintly in the distance. I heard that comment, but that makes sense. So he talked about, I think his aunt would send him these crates of grapefruit. And so he just said, okay, he would work with that. And here's a close-up to give you a better sense of this painting. And it's very much these patches of dense color and paint on the surface. He said he wasn't so much interested in the subject matter, he was more interested in the form and pushing it towards abstraction. But he did other still life setups. He mentioned being inspired by Morandi and other artists at this period. And you can see, and I like his hands are included in these as he's posing the paintings. But you can see that even though there's a kind of still life setup of bottles or cups or what have you, they become more and more abstract, where you can't really tell that what the objects even are.
This seems like even for Sol LeWitt, you have to work through your heroes in order to get your original voice. There seems to be Nicholas de Stael in here and some other people.
So a nice detail to give you a sense of how he was working with the paint. most of these, he doesn't seem to use the brush, but he would use the palette knife, and he talked a bit about that, kind of troweling on the paint in a kind of sculptural way, which makes sense in relation to, when he was a student at Syracuse University, he mainly made prints, he made lithographs, but he often would work in terms of the drawing in a subtractive way on the stone. So I see similar things there. He also worked with figuration, so these may be from life, from models. He cited Giacometti as an influence here, but here definitely he's using the tip of the brush handle itself to gouge out paint, or the palette knife to kind of incise the image in the layers of paint. So again, working in a kind of sculptural way, in a subtractive way, in this case. Also during this period, it's fairly well known that he became influenced by, just kind of randomly, he came across a book by Edward Muybridge of animal locomotion as well as human images of humans in motion. And these influenced ultimately his interest in serial art. The idea of showing different moments or variations of the same module over time or in a series. So this was a big influence, but immediately when he found them in the early 60s, he started integrating these figures into paintings. So these paintings look mainly abstract. This one was actually on the left, was in the background of the New York Times photo at the very back of the space. So the running man and summer assaulting figure appear in a lot of the transitional paintings during this period. He, through several people, including Eva Hesse, who was a dear friend who had trained at Yale with Joseph Albers, became interested in Albers. So you see kind of nested squares, this idea of receding and advancing color became of interest to him. And then eventually the paintings combined with sculptural elements. So on the left, that's actually a recess, a kind of opening into the canvas. So it's receding. And then on the right, we have these concentric squares that are advancing quite literally out from the surface of the painting. These were the first structures, this term that he used, because they combine sculpture and painting in such an obvious way. And then right after this, he decided just to let the structures come to the floor, and that led to his first sculptural works that he showed in 1965. That was his first one-man show in New York, all sculptural works. So that is I hope, an interesting kind of set of experiments from painting to sculpture that leads to the mature work that I showed you and perhaps you're familiar with. But then the other photo, which shows LeWitt as a mature artist in his early 70s, in this studio he built in 1990 in Chester, Connecticut. And by the way, these two photos it's really hard to find photos of LeWitt working in a studio or any photos of him because he did not like posing for photos. This is just a snapshot that we're lucky survives that shows him working in his studio in Chester. So in the 1980s and into the 90s, he had a disciplined daily practice of working in the studio and painting. And he worked in the medium of gouache on paper. And these works ranged in size from very small works to fairly large, up to 5 by 5 feet or 5 to 15 feet. And so here's some views of that studio, which is preserved today in Chester pretty much the way he left it when he died in 2007. But you can see a big painting table in the middle, painting wall, which shows, and also up here, he would buy a big roll of paper that was 5 feet wide, and then he could create these large pieces and staple a large piece of paper up to 15 feet across. And typically he would work on small and medium-sized 22 by 30 Fabriano sheets. He would use those for the gouaches, and then these larger works, and he would work simultaneously in the studio, exploring a certain particular visual language. So LeWitt as painter is really surprising. To me, I think still surprising. And the gouaches really have not been worked on. They appeared in the great 2000 retrospective of his work that was at the Whitney Museum and two other museums. But they really weren't commented on very much. There was so much work in that show, and his work is so diverse, and I think people have had trouble really grappling with them. He said about the gouaches that the ideas of the gouaches do not run parallel with those of the wall drawings. They are quite different and follow their own logic. The wall drawings have ideas that can be transmitted to others to realize, the ways that we were talking about, but only I can do the gouaches. Now, I mean, one important point about the gouaches is of course, their signature works. They very much depend on his hand. And this is so counter to the rest of his work. There's one of the main problems, is how to connect what he's doing in the gouaches with the rest of the work, though there are interesting connections, of course. But these were works that he explored on his own in the studio. Sometimes you can see overlaps, especially with the visual languages he's using. With the wall drawings, you see overlaps. But for the most of the time, the gouaches are totally of their own, with their own unique languages that he explored only in the gouaches.
Don't you think it's a little bit like a guitarist, so just like riffing and trying to find some ideas and then building them when they come upon something? Do you feel that's a parallel or not?
Well, I think that's true, and that he certainly did that, exploring different visual languages in the wall drawings. But of course, they didn't depend on his hand, and he didn't want the wall drawings ever to look like they were the product of an individual artist's hand. In fact, that's one of the rules of the installation of the wall drawings, is that when you have 3 or 4 artists working on them, they are to work over the entire wall and not fixate on one area, so that by the end of the wall drawing, especially the ones that are layered in color ink, you can't see a hand. In fact, John Hogan and Anthony Sensoda, who worked on so many of the wall drawings for Sol, they call it the democratic hand. It's supposed to be generic and general, that no one hand stands out. So in the gouaches, of course, he's riffing on ideas, but I think what's so fascinating is, like many artists in their studio, he wanted the pleasure of doing that on his own and using his hand. And he did talk about it a bit. LeWitt wasn't famous for talking so much about his work or what he was trying to accomplish, but with the gouaches, he left behind some sense of what he was trying, or what he enjoyed about making them. So starting with, they're in order, I think, chronologically. This form derived from a cube, so he was famous for cubic images and geometric figures. So some of the gouaches overlap those interests that you see in the wall drawings and in the structures. This particular work, we have this quote about the cube. He wrote this very short piece in 1966 about the cube, which is revealing. The most interesting characteristic of the cube is that it is relatively uninteresting. Compared to any other three-dimensional form, the cube lacks any aggressive force, implies no motion, and is least emotive. Therefore, it is the best form to use as a basic unit, the grammatical device from which the work may proceed. Now, that's very much in the spirit of how he used geometry. It wasn't about the geometry or any ideology or utopian ideas connected to geometry, but it was about using it as an armature for exploring variation and color, and the cube was the perfect. But what's nice is the contrast. It implies no motion and is least emotive. But in gouache form, the cube does become somewhat emotive, like this little gouache shows. This was made in 1991, and it's related, as we were saying, to some of the wall drawings, which you see here, variations of cubes and isometric presentation of a cube. But of course here, the drafters are following directions, a diagram with the labeled layers of color. They're very cleanly rendered on the wall, so it's very much about following his idea. But in 91, he created, and this shows the ambition of the gouaches, I think, this piece called 100 Cubes. So we have these, each is 22 by 15 inches, this incredible set of gouaches. And this is 91. In 93, he made another large series of gouaches. So he was interested in pursuing them in a serial way, which matches his overall approach to art making. But each one of these is his own kind of, as you said, riff on the cube. So just showing you a few details of these. Some very cleanly rendered, very much like the wall drawings, again in layers of 2-3-part combinations of color. Remember, he's primarily working with the primary colors plus gray and black. But then by somewhere near the end of the 100 cubes, the form starts to fall apart a little bit. They're clearly a kind of tour de force of painting, of using the medium of gouache and showing what he can do with it as a master of the medium. So the backgrounds become very expressive and painterly. This wet on wet technique where the cube starts to kind of float away and come apart. And these are, I think, the last two in the series. By the way, they produced a book from this 100, so it's called 100 Cubes, easy to find, still available. I think an incredible.
I worked on it.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. So I think these two are very much in the spirit of the one that's on display here, where we have these facets, but they take on a kind of play of flatness and depth because of his very painterly approach to the medium. As I said earlier, some of the gouaches, and as LeWitt said, have nothing to do with the wall drawings. They explore visual ideas that are totally counter to the wall drawings, like this one, Color Brushstrokes from 1994. It's a reign of these short vertical brushstrokes. The brushstroke was not something used in the wall drawings, though I should say, kind of parenthetically, there are 3 examples, 2 from 1994 and the one later, where he tried to use the brushstroke in a wall drawing, but not in a layered way, just kind of all by itself. But they seem to not be successful. He seemed not to find it possible to employ a kind of language, but he does so.
Do you think, though, with
this
this piece that he was open to people feeling their own metaphor, that it could actually feel like rain, it could feel like, pellets of water coming down?
Yeah, I think these gouaches are the most evocative and poetic of his works. And he was clearly open to that because he wouldn't have made them, because the visual effects are so rich. So here, he's working with the primaries in white and black, but then you get these wonderful mixes that take place in the surface, in the layering, and on the surface of the paper. But I think these, in many ways, he's flirting with these poetic suggestions. What's that?
No, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Reminded me of the ones you showed at the beginning.
Oh yeah, in terms of the painting. Yeah, so that's a good point. Thanks for interjecting that. Because part of what I'm trying to figure out is how that early LeWitt connects to this LeWitt, but also the fact that he's returning to his love of painting. And I think this is part of an argument that I'll be making in this book, is that it's a way for him to return to so many of the issues around painting that were popular and being debated in the mid-50s when he arrived in New York. And so now it's his chance to make a contribution to that. So these gouaches very much are about his use of the medium and his mastery of it, but also issues of transparency and opacity, a sense of weight and layering, the surface of the work versus any kind of depth or illusion. So all these basic themes of abstract painting, especially, he's dealing with. What's remarkable to me is there's very little comment on the fact that he's doing, even though he's making hundreds and hundreds of gouaches in the last 2 decades of his career.
Could you talk a minute about the fact that he lived in Italy, in Spoleto, and had a place outside of in the Amalfi Coast, but just quickly about the idea of Fra Angelico, Masaccio, and some of his heroes, and how that relates to these gouaches or the wall drawings.
Yeah, And yeah, Della Francesca as well. So he was a fan of 14th and 15th century Italian fresco and Giotto as well. And he talked about these artists. So it's one thing that he did talk about, this influence and inspiration from these artists in Italy. And like you said, he moved in 1980 to Spoleto, and he was surrounded by it. So you do see these changes in his work, in the wall drawings especially. So the wall drawings are part of my project as well, where they become more painterly in terms of the color ink washes, as well as the acrylic wall drawings at the end. The scale changes. He becomes interested in not just one wall, but 4 walls, the idea of surrounding the viewer, creating an overall context.
Excuse me, but have you seen these artists? They all did that.
Right.
So he was there and looking at it.
Exactly. Yeah, so it was a powerful influence, but it's been commented on very little. He would talk about the influence, but I think in terms of seeing the wall drawings and what they're doing in dialogue with it, that's definitely something I'm interested in. So in the gouaches, he's exploring these new visual languages here, wavy brushstrokes. What's interesting is when you look at this up close, you'll see that it's not just a kind of, it doesn't have a kind of randomness necessarily, though there's a little of it. Each of these languages does have its own system. They're not totally free-form and intuitive. He's exploring a certain language, here these wavy brushstrokes, and he's layering them in a way so that they seem to kind of interweave through the layers. So it's a very methodical and fairly precise exploration. But you can see up close just how painterly they are. You can see the brush strokes, individual hairs of the brush, and the wetness of the medium as he's painting. This is one of my favorite pieces, definitely. Squiggly brush strokes. You have to go look at it if you haven't looked at it. So here, the language, squiggly brush strokes. Okay, that's pretty clear. Short little squiggles in the primaries and white and black. The whole background is painted blue, saturated with that wonderful blue. And then LeWitt, throughout his career, was open to setting up situations where there was accident and chance. He would allow that to happen, just like the optical experience, the experience for the viewer could be open to interpretation, could be evocative and poetic. So there are all these great little dramas taking place in this gouache. This is one of my favorite moments where the white and black becomes a kind of interswirl, and then the colors bleed into each other with little fingers that reach out and kind of embrace surrounding squiggle marks. And at certain points, you can't tell at all what the mark is supposed to be. It becomes so.
I think it's so interesting that this is really like an original voice where you've not seen it, whereas the early work when he's working with oil, it really does remind us of de Kooning and de Stael and Morandi and all these other Giacometti, as you say. This is really an original voice. Nobody done this before.
Yeah. So when the gouaches were shown in exhibitions in the early 90s, there was an exhibition of drawings that toured the country, and it included some of the gouaches from the early 90s. Critics were a little torn about what to make of them. So you had reviews in the New York Times, dueling reviews, where one reviewer said that they revealed this playful side of LeWitt and they were so personal and expressive, and another critic was like, yeah, they look that way, but they're impersonal and highly controlled. And I think they are controlled. I don't think they're impersonal, but it's important to know that he was still interested in control because that was such a motivating part of how he made work. He wanted to set up parameters and specific languages that he had to explore, and certain rules. So you've noticed in all of these that they have an all-over composition, right? So from edge to edge. And his approach to each visual language is consistent. So if you look at a series of gouaches done with the same visual language, he's trying his best to make it identifiable so that you'll recognize his squiggly brushstrokes or his vertical brushstrokes.
But do you believe the whole argument that he set up rules and then broke them late in his career?
It is true that he actually mentioned at a certain point that he got tired of his own rules. he had said, he made these, wrote these manifestos, and then he felt kind of boxed in by kind of mid-career. So he did begin to break the rules, but I think there is a remarkable consistency to his overall body of work. These may look so different, but then when you start looking at the early work, for instance, this gouache, I can connect it to prints that he made in the early 70s, where he used a little squiggly line. It was fine and it didn't bleed into the other lines, but there were prints in the 90s where there are aquatints and sugarlit prints where you do get this kind of merging that's going on, but in a very controlled way of printmaking. But here, he's exploring the same language, but now it becomes something a lot freer. I mean, he could have thrown this away if he didn't want us to look at it. He clearly loved how the marks interacted and bled into each other and created these little drawings. This is another piece on display from '97, Irregular Form. And around this period, he made a lot of gouaches. This one is just around 11 by 11 inches. There's some that are 5 feet by 5 feet that explored these irregular forms that he called them. This particular one was part of a series of small gouaches that was reproduced as a portfolio. These, I think, I can't help but to think of color field painting. It's his little riff on Helen Frankenthaler and the idea of these spills of color. The figure ground is usually 2 colors, though when you see them in person, they're very layered in terms of layers of more than 2 colors. But they're really evocative. They remind me of like cartography, like aerial views of coastlines. I think these and some of the other gouaches really flirt with representation. He wants you to see something, and yet it's not quite anything. It's just in irregular form. So I love that, because in the history of abstract painting, as many of you know, I'm sure you're thinking of other artists, the kind of blob, the form becomes really important, and Motherwell and other artists, Gottlieb. And here, this is his version of that. In fact, in the early 90s, he made a series of black gouaches that are irregular forms, and he made some others that he called blobs. He also was fond of splotch. That was another term that he used for some sculptural works later. So again, I think he's exploring certain aspects of abstract expressionism, abstract painting, but as you were saying, I think in a new way that people hadn't quite seen, and definitely not from LeWitt. And there you can see some of the red coming through the blue on top of it. And then there are these, this is Parallel Curves from 1999. There are lots of gouaches that work with these band-like forms. So here the brushstroke becomes controlled in a way that you can read it as a band. So these flowing serpentine visual languages, parallel curves. It appears around the time of a language in the wall drawings called loopy-doopy, another great LeWittian term. In '98, they appear in a couple wall drawings, this one and this one in '80. They look kind of botanical. You can't quite pin down, but it looks vine-like as it spreads across the wall. So these usually feature these contrast of 2 colors with these great effects of the background color coming through or kind of vibrating optically with the bands in front of it. And then this leads to things that are so counter to the wall drawings. Tangled Bands from 2001. And here definitely that sense of transparency and opacity. Yeah.
Good question. Loopy-doopy, though, is directly translated to wall drawings.
Yeah, so loopy-doopy doesn't exist in the gouaches.
Not at all.
And it exists in the wall drawings. And of course, it exists there because he would draw a very precise diagram of it, a drawing. So to create this work, by this point in his career, you have to project the diagram on the wall and then trace it. So here it's very cleanly rendered in acrylic paint, which is counter to the way these serpentine languages exist in the gouaches. where it's very much about the control of the medium and the brush so that you can keep that consistent thickness of the band as you create the work. And here you can see just how much control is involved. And this piece, of course, he's playing so much with surface and some sense of depth, even if it's shallow. It's still this wonderful play, this matrix of tangled bands. And then I think the last image we have is this horizontal brushstrokes. He made many hundreds of gouaches that feature horizontal brushstrokes, really kind of calming, meditative pieces. This is 45 by 45 inches. Some of them are 10 feet across. And they all have this kind of, it's a kind of illusion or trick where it looks as if he's painted the brushstroke from one edge of the paper all the way, he's loaded the brush and just kept going in this very consistent way. It's an illusion because nobody can quite do that because you run out of paint, but he's carefully knitted the bands together so that you do have this sense that he's made these incredible brushstrokes that just spread out across the sheet of paper.
Don't you think there's also a sense of humor? It's like horizontal brushstrokes, more or less, and that he seems like he's got these rules, more or less. Can you talk about that a little bit?
And that's true. He had a great sense of humor.
Yeah.
And obviously, these terms, more or less in parentheses, loopy doopy, blob, splotch, these different languages, sometimes the descriptions are so just blunt and kind of ridiculous. So, I think he hopes that the viewer will be entertained by the work. It's, it shouldn't be deadly serious. Some people.
There's kind of like a little wink, of the eye with him.
Yeah.
A little bit.
And actually, that's very true from the beginning of his career. Because I think, especially in the, in the 70s with the wall drawings in pencil at the very beginning, people were very confused about how to engage with them. They were hard to see. They challenged you visually. These aren't challenging, they're just delightful as you engage with them. But I think he acknowledges that he didn't want to create something that was, people expected dry conceptual art, just about ideas. But the surprise with LeWitt always is that it's not just ideas. It becomes a really interesting visual and spatial experience often as you move around the work and take it in.
Before we get to questions, I was just going to say that we did a wall drawing at my gallery in Kent, Connecticut. I wanted to defy the idea of what a gallery in Connecticut was going to be like, selling landscapes that were easy. So we did this wall drawing, and these, first we had to prepare the wall. It had to be absolutely perfect. And then there were these instructions with the diagram, and it had R, G, Y, B for yellow, gray, blue, and red. And so they started out doing this. First they did a grid, and it was very much like the one you showed at Mass MoCA of these diagonal lines coming out like this with a black border. So they forgot one step. So it was like R, R, R. So it was just 3 coats of red. So the first one, you go like this, and you go ch-ch-ch-ch. And there's a specific way to do it. And they forgot one of them in mixing the colors. So they had to undo it. They had to paint it back to white, and they had to start over again. So I said to the drafts person, that's pretty severe. They said, Sol LeWitt said that making great art is not easy. And I really kind of loved that, and for me, it was like being inside the mind of Sol LeWitt, and it was something really beautiful. I wanted to be there the whole day while we were doing it. And when we had to paint it out, because we didn't sell it, we painted the wall black, because that was the border was black, and then I did LeWitt gouaches on the wall instead.
That's great.
And it was just like it. So we made the transition from wall drawing to gouache, which is really, I think, one of the topics. But who has questions for David? He really would love to field any question, I'm sure. Anything? Yeah.
Sure. The horizontal brushstrokes, the one that's in that
Mhm.
before, is one of them a background color, or are they both?
That's a great question. So here he's painted the entire sheet yellow. And so that was a typical procedure, as you saw in some of these, to start with a background color. Sometimes that color is layered on top of another, and you can sometimes see that. Sometimes you have to get very close and see that effect.
I would say also for anybody coming to the booth, if you want to look, a great exercise, I think, it works with the squiggly brush strokes and all of these. Look for one color and kind of like let your eyes go blurry, and you see the yellow protrude, and then you look again, and the blue-black comes in. But especially with the squiggly brush strokes, if you look for light, it pops. If you look for black, blue, whatever, and everything else recedes, it's such a fascinating exercise visually.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering if you have insight into his psychological condition or how he was as a person, like this intense tension between rules and revolution and thinking beyond his time, but also this playfulness, and I'm just wondering what it was like for him inside his head or by himself or with his friends and family.
Wouldn't we all like to know?
I have a related question, maybe we could
Okay.
answer together, if that's okay.
Mhm.
So what I know about Sol is his sense of community and
Mhm.
playfulness. He had, he was incredibly supportive to a lot of artists. He traded work, everyone, all the artists who made work for him. He was generous to anyone who worked in his studio. And so I was looking for a sense of like community in the gouaches. And someone mentioned that you said they were considered very personal by someone. And I wonder, how personal do you think the gouaches are? Or are they also about community?
Well, I mean,
I wonder if that.
yeah, this is good, and you answered it in part. I mean, one thing I should say is, and you mentioned and reinforced, is that he was an incredibly generous person. Social in an interesting way, because he was very shy, but he did build up a strong community of friends. He was very supportive, as you said, of fellow artists, and very generous in terms of trading work, and built a large collection of art by other artists. I mentioned earlier, but haven't told you that there was that one quote where he talks about the gouaches and how they differ from the wall drawings. He also revealed his pleasure in working in the studio. He enjoyed the movement and motion of his body and his arm as he made these works. When he said that to an interviewer, they were like, so it's about emotion and a kind of expressive. He said it's a controlled movement. It's not about emotion. So he was always playing that in between of being controlled, but playful enough that he ends up creating these visual experiences for others. But I think he was a really well-grounded man who he had 2 daughters. He lived a really fruitful life in Connecticut, obviously in Chester, but also in Italy. He would return every summer there to his house and his studio there as well. So I don't think the idea of control and giving up control, it's definitely part of the work, but he never gave us a narrative of what exactly was going on in his brain, except people would often assume that the work was meant to be complex and confounding and really mathematical, and especially a lot of the earlier work. And he said he knew nothing about mathematics, that it wasn't, that was just a way for him to order his kind of thinking and his ideas and his visual world.
David,
Does that help? Yeah.
it's almost impossible looking at you not to see the water.
I know.
And when you see these, not to think about these works in relation to water. And can you talk about, right, so can you talk about, the Amalfi Coast and his home there, just very briefly, in the water there?
Yes, so there's this incredible home in Briano that was handed down to the family of his wife, Carol. So he had these experiences of nature, not just of culture in Italy. Definitely, I think these definitely evoke nature as well as these other serpentine images. But again, they're definitely in the spirit of other visual languages that he explored from the very beginning of his career as well. So other questions? Yes?
I'm just struck by the cube, that 100 cubes, and his interest in cubes. But when I look at them, it's odd to me that they're placed within that rectangle with really no feeling of space around them. And it kind of bothers me. But I'm just...
In a good way?
They seem like bad compositions.
Well, he very intentionally uses this unrealistic perspective, right? So he noticed that in the architectural renderings and these fresco paintings from the 14th and 15th century, often there's this awkward perspective, isometric, where there's a kind of depth, the revealing of different sides or facets of an object, but it's very flat. So he did speak of that. He wanted the space to be as shallow as possible. So you would mainly see a two-dimensional image.
Could you comment on the tile and ceramic works in relationship to gouache on one hand and wall drawings on the other?
So you know about the ceramics that he made in Italy. Are you thinking of specific ones, or?
Well, it was like the tiles in particular are somewhere between gouache and wall drawing, it feels like.
Yeah, so he, when he moved to Italy, he and Carol worked with a local group of ceramicists to create ceramic works, mainly based on his star motifs, but also lines in four directions or bands in four directions. When I think of those, they're more like the contract work of hiring someone to do the wall drawings or the structures. The ceramicists are creating those works.
So his hand is not involved.
His hand is not involved, but they definitely have a painterly quality if you don't have in the back.
I thought it was really interesting that I didn't know about the certificates before, and then in comparison to how it's like only I can do the gouaches. So I'm just curious if he ever talked about what makes something original, or like the originality of a work. And because on one hand there's like the gouaches are done by his own hand, but then the idea. So I just was wondering if you had.
So to him, definitely read these early pieces where he articulates his form of conceptual art. But it was about the idea. That was the original thing to him. And as I said earlier, the work was a perfunctory affair. It's so blunt, but of course, what you've seen, I hope, in the presentation is the work does matter what comes out. And then in his studio, of course, he's invested fully in creating these signature personal works. He talked about how it was integrated into the ritual of his life, his work in the studio, creating these pieces. So it's a kind of back and forth. You can take, his work, definitely look at these books and other catalogs on LeWitt, because his work is, he works in so many different mediums. There's, the conceptual part that is an overarching way of creating the work. There are procedures and systems that generate the work. And even in his studio, he's still using those parameters to help kind of curtail his activities in the studio. So it is often this balance between letting himself go, but always reining himself in. Yeah. Good.
His evinced visibility, somewhere along the way I read his instructions for his installations, meticulous and creative, and you read them.
Yeah, some of them are can be quite simple, but some of the directions can be very long. In fact, you have a drawing on display.
Location of the square, and you've got to try to read it. It's almost impossible to not break out laughing, because it's such simple language and you can't follow it. Come and look at it. It's really amazing.
Yeah, and often these directions will include some element that frees up the drafter to add something, to make a decision on their own that determines the outcome of the wall drawing, like the length of the line or the direction of the line. Sometimes the numbers of radiating lines in some of the early wall drawings too. Yeah.
Given the organicness of the horizontal brushstrokes and all of that, did it take him several tries to achieve how kind of fluid it was? And that's what he gave away to his, people working in a studio, because he's like, this isn't perfect.
And that's a good question. He would often warm up on smaller sheets of paper to warm up the language to see if he could achieve it at that small scale before he would move on to a larger sheet and then an even larger sheet. And often he did give away these smaller works.
But no, I wouldn't say he gave away unfinished work.
Oh, no, not at all.
No, it,
No, no.
a mistake or, no,
No.
it get destroyed.
So-
Assistants were given lovely.
Were you one of his assistants?
I was not, but I know a bunch and I know
Oh,
some
yeah.
as well.
Yeah, he would-
He
yeah.
worked in studio.
Awesome. Yeah, he wouldn't give away work that was
No.
not
But
finished.
was it built upon the stroke, or was it, he said, because he was such a
Right.
control freak, so maybe he was like, this isn't perfect, or was it worked upon, because those are two different methods?
No, I think he would warm up on smaller sheets of paper so that he would perfect the language at that scale. And certainly he would throw away work that wasn't successful.
Talk about control of his wall drawings, and I think about the fluidness of his gouaches. How would you speak to the copied lines wall drawings?
Can you say a little more? Which wall drawings are
the
you
copied lines, where it starts with one line and then people, whoever, can come and
Right.
participate in the wall drawing.
There are a few wall drawings where it has a kind of set of rules where one person starts the drawing by creating a line along the top, or sometimes there's a vertical line that you have to reach as high as you can go. And then, what was the question about
Well, there's
those?
such a level of fluidness there as opposed to the controlled nature of his other wall drawings.
Yeah, I think these particular ones, he's allowing the drafters to take control of what the work's going to look like in the end. Because that first line that's drawn determines all the others, because the next ones have to try to copy the trajectory next to that line and so forth. So you'll find in, there are 1,300 wall drawings or more than that we get this variation of ones where he's allowing the drafters some room to participate in the work in terms of the outcome, and then others where it's more highly controlled. I think we've run out of time, but thank you so much for coming.